All right, so we're going to talk about the cell membrane. We start out this with understanding that the cell membrane is not like a plastic bag. Instead, it's like a floating collection of molecules that like to stay near one another and that form a membrane, but aren't necessarily like a solid object. So it's a lipid bilayer, which means bilayer just means there's two layers. There's two layers to the cell membrane. Each layer is made of these lipids, these phospholipids. They have a hydrophilic head, which means at one end of the molecule, there is the head of it loves the water. It loves to be near the water. It loves to be close to water. And then there's a hydrophobic tail. Hydrophobic, water phobic, or water hating. And the idea is that what happens is that these molecules, where one end loves the water and one end hates the water, they line up in that bilayer, in that double layer for the membrane of the cell. And on either side of it, the outside, which faces the water outside the cell, and the inside, which faces the water inside the cell, that's where the part that likes water, the hydrophilic part, is, the head of it. And then the tails go towards the center. The tails meet in the center in this hydrophobic space. And by having a water loving sort of layer followed by the tails behind it, you end up with this water hating membrane formed by the hydrophobic tails in the center of it. It's a bilayer because there are two back-to-back phospholipids that all come together in this big group in order to form the layer. It's a fluid mosaic model in that these phospholipids are not attached to one another. They freely float around in the membrane itself while being the membrane. In many ways, it's like having a bunch of ping pong balls on top of some water. The individual ping pong balls are not connected to each other, but they form a layer of ping pong balls that, even if you can push it to the side slightly and expose the water for a moment, they flow back in and continue to maintain a continuous level of ping pong balls above the water. What it looks like, an artist's representation, is this. The orange is the hydrophilic or water-loving head of a phospholipid. The little black sort of daggery looking thing, the tail coming off of that head, is the fatty acid hydrophobic or water-hating tail. So the two tails next to each other form a water-hating portion of the membrane in the middle of it, so that it is much more difficult for anything to pass across this membrane, to go from the outside over here to the inside over here. Now, floating in this membrane are these big old pieces that are proteins. And essentially what these proteins do is they manage most of the traffic from the inside to the outside of the cell, or from the inside to the outside of the cell, or from the outside of the cell to the inside of the cell. They manage most of that traffic. Some of them are channel proteins, some of them are transport proteins, some of them are protein pumps, some of them are proteins with a carbohydrate that goes fishing for a particular element and then pulls it in. But the point is that this phospholipid bilayer forms a membrane that basically shows the definition of the line between the inside of the cell and the outside of the cell. It cannot be easily passed through by most things in the body or most things in the cell. And the primary way that things have to come in and out of the cell, that food comes in to the cell and waste leaves the cell, is through these proteins of various kinds. When it comes to transport there are two kinds of transport. There's passive transport and active transport. Passive transport, there's no energy involved. And that's going to be the title of our next video.